Hey guys, welcome to another installment of Hilliard at Home. Today's topic is naturalism, which was a literary movement that emerged alongside of realism in the late 19th century. In fact, many critics regard naturalism as just a particular version of realism that gets a bit more gritty and seedy in its portrayal of social experience. But don't tell that to Frank Norris. Norris was a prominent writer around the turn of the 20th century who wrote one of the most famous naturalist novels of the period, McTeague, which is about a humble dentist who gets embroiled in a drama of sexual desire and greed and ends up killing both his wife and his best friend. Norris was critical of realist literature, which he felt was lacking in romance. Romance, in its original meaning, simply refers to literature that involves adventure and excitement, not to literature about romantic relationships. Norris understood realist literature to involve everyday people engaged in everyday events. "This is realism," he famously quipped. "It is the smaller details of everyday life, things that are likely to happen between lunch and supper, small passions, restricted emotions, dramas of the reception room, tragedies of an afternoon call, crises involving cups of tea. Everyone will admit there is no romance here." Naturalism, by contrast, involved everyday people thrown into extraordinary circumstances. And it is within such circumstances, Norris argued, that the individual's true nature shows itself. Terrible things must happen to the characters of the naturalistic tale. They must be twisted from the ordinary, wrenched out from the quiet, uneventful round of everyday life, and flung into the throes of a vast and terrible drama that works itself out in unleashed passions, in blood, and in sudden death. Now that's romance. Naturalist writers like Norris understood their fiction as an almost scientific examination of human nature. And as children of the Darwinian revolution within the natural and social sciences, these writers understood human nature to be fundamentally tied to our evolutionary history as a species embroiled in the constant struggle for survival. For naturalist writers, no individual is superior to that nature. And if that nature is difficult to see in a particular individual's behavior, it's either because that individual is good at hiding it, or he or she has never been put under the kind of stress in which that nature reveals itself. According to Norris, then, naturalist fiction puts its characters under that kind of stress in order to reveal the raw nature that hides beneath the comforts and conveniences of our everyday existence. Such literature, he argues, is an instrument, keen, finely tempered, flawless, an instrument with which we may go straight through the clothes and tissues and wrappings of flesh, down deep into the red, living heart of things. That sounds pretty intense, right? And intensity is definitely the name of the game in naturalist fiction, as characters find themselves in severe circumstances that test them to the limits. In some naturalist fiction, these struggles involve a man versus nature theme. A classic example is Jack London's story To Build a Fire, about a newcomer in the Yukon Territory who ventures out into sub-zero temperatures despite the warnings of a more experienced inhabitant. He arrogantly believes that he is superior to nature, but he receives a reality check when he slips through thin ice, soaking his feet and legs in the icy water below. To survive, he must build a fire to dry and warm himself, but this seemingly simple task becomes agonizingly difficult as he makes crucial errors and begins to lose feeling in his extremities. The narrative proceeds with gut-wrenching intensity as the man slowly freezes to death. Most naturalist fiction, however, involves gritty social circumstances rather than struggles within nature. But the effect is usually very similar, and there's a very good reason for this. In order to understand this reason, let's think about the classic theme of nature versus nurture, which is pretty common in all types of literature. When we refer to nature versus nurture, we're talking about how individual character and behavior is shaped by our basic human nature versus how individual character and behavior is shaped by our social experience or our culture. Now, this theme is so prevalent and powerful for us because we tend to understand nature and culture as fundamentally different from each other, and usually as fundamentally opposed to each other. In literature that takes up this theme, then, one realm, nature or culture, is represented as corrupt or degraded, while the other realm represents a means of escaping or transcending that corruption and degradation. In a lot of Victorian literature from the latter half of the 19th century, for instance, human nature is represented as animalistic and savage, while the advancements of civilization or culture provide a way to transcend that savagery and live on a higher moral plane. Among other things, this logic was often used to justify the cruelties of colonialism as necessary in order to bring the blessings of civilization to the so-called savages in the global South. This was the central argument of European and American imperialism during the time period. By contrast, Ralph Waldo Emerson, a transcendentalist of the mid-19th century or antebellum period, argued that society is corrupt and degraded, while human nature is not only good, but divine. Emerson praised what he referred to as the self-reliant individual, the individual who rejects all the influences of society and embraces his inner divine self, and in doing so, lives on a higher moral plane. Now, in these two examples, the imperialist literature of the Victorian era and Emerson's antebellum transcendentalism, we see opposite arguments. But in a certain way, they're the same. They're both narratives of escape from a realm of corruption and degradation into a realm of higher moral existence. For the naturalist writer, however, no such escape is possible. Let's talk about why. So, I've already referred to naturalist writers as, quote, children of the Darwinian revolution in the natural and social sciences. This means that, following from Darwin's insights about evolutionary processes, naturalists understood the human species to be a product of a series of natural accidents that led gradually, mutation by tiny mutation, to the types of intelligence that have allowed us to build the complex societies that we inhabit today. Each of those tiny mutations were selected, to use Darwin's term, because they made the species a little bit more capable within the constant struggle for resources and survival. But none of those mutations took the species beyond that struggle. None of those mutations made us anything more than natural creatures. We might be marvelously complex, but there's no magical or supernatural component to the human self that takes us beyond that ongoing struggle for resources and survival. This means that the societies that we have created, no matter how modern or magnificent they might be, are always just products of our basic human nature as a species and our basic struggle to survive. Those societies might look sophisticated, they might look like the very opposite of nature. But when you strip away all those appearances and get down to what Frank Norris referred to as the red living heart of things, you find that society is always just a reflection or an outgrowth of human nature. That being the case, there is no true or absolute escape from corruption and degradation because nature and culture, nature and nurture, are really one and the same. Neither is any better or more morally pure than the other. In naturalist fiction, then, we often find characters who might think that they can escape from the corruptions and degradations of their conditions, and they might even seem to escape for a time. But ultimately, they find that such escape is impossible because there's nothing beyond that natural system that includes both the human creature and its social creations. Even if they are able to change their conditions, they find that their new conditions, as different as they might be, are no more moral or pure or civilized than their previous conditions. They haven't really escaped at all. This is the plot of one of the most famous naturalist novels, Theodore Dreiser's Sister Carrie. Carrie Meeber is a young woman who has been raised in rural poverty, but at the beginning of the novel is moving to Chicago to live with her married sister. She thinks that she is entering a new and better life, but soon learns that being poor in the city is just as bad, if not worse, than being poor in the country. She again believes that she can escape the degrading conditions of poverty by moving in with a man who makes much more money than her sister's husband does. This introduces Carrie to a fast life where she becomes an actress and engages in a wild affair with an even more wealthy man. But then she becomes embroiled in scandal, participates in a fraudulent marriage, moves to Montreal and then New York, experiences poverty once again, and works her way out of it by dumping her fake husband and working as a chorus girl, and so on and so on. Through all of these adventures, through times of fortune and fame, and times of severe deprivation, Carrie ultimately finds that she has never found the type of escape that she has always sought. Whether she's wearing cheap rags or expensive jewelry, she is always engaged in the same endless and demeaning struggle. That struggle takes different shapes within different contexts, but it's always the same at its core. And there's nothing beyond or outside of it because, again, social reality is always a reflection or an outgrowth of our basic human nature within the constant struggle for survival. There's nothing about Carrie or about anyone else that is superior to that struggle, nothing that transcends that struggle. To go back to the nature versus nurture theme, naturalist writers would very much agree that we're products of our social environments, that we're shaped by our social experience. But they would also argue that our social environments are shaped by and are part of our basic human nature. Within this view, human nature and human society are not separate, distinct things. They're parts of one interconnected natural system from which there is no escape, no transcendence. There are no better days or better lives than the ones we have within that system. We might be able to dress those lives up and make them seem like something superior to our base creature nature. But eventually, when those lives come under stress, all those illusions will collapse, and those lives will be revealed to be just as dirty and mean as the rest of the world around them. And this is the central drama, the existential tragedy that naturalist fiction attempts to lay bare. Well, there may be no escape for the characters in naturalist fiction, but it's time for us to escape from this video. In a moment, you'll see links to other Hilliard at Home videos, but you should also be able to find links to those videos in e-courses. You should also check e-courses for any quizzes, discussion boards, or assignments related to this video. Thanks for watching.